used to be based in the little park as you go into the Fellows Cafe, which is called Pioneer Park. And there is a time capsule. And I think it's to be opened in about 2030, something like that. I don't know what's in it. I imagine there'll be thongs and things like that. But the island population got too big, and the memorial was moved here so that we can have a crowd, a very big crowd on Anzac Day, is to point out the cypress pines. You notice that they've got a different green, and we call this the emerald fringe. Jan McIntyre's here, she did the hard work. We had it registered as a landscape of cultural significance with the state government through the Redland Council. They maintain the register. And in the hope that in times to come when people are trying to get private access to the beach, we'll be able to use that to block them, to formalise it.
Thank you.
It also happens to be a breeding ground for the lorikeets. Quite a usually there's a lot around, and you'll see them in holes in the trees. Yes, about the emerald fringe itself, when development happened in Queensland, it happened quite quickly. John Oxley came up here in 1823. Matthew Flinders had been up here in 1799, and his job was to map the mouths of rivers, because the British were used to rivers leading to something good in Europe. And they thought, the place is so big, there must be rivers leading to something good that we can take home. And so he came up the coast, he managed to miss the Clarence, and then he came into Moreton Bay, and he didn't find any rivers here either. But essentially, the reason he was missing the rivers is that they all had bars across their mouth, and it was not visible from the sea. And by definition, he couldn't get very close because it got shallow as well. So he missed the Brisbane River, then he went up to White Bay, and he missed the Mary River. And then he went home because he only given a certain amount of time to use the boat. We're going to collect cedar down around Illawarra, and a storm blew up, and they got disorientated and wound up on Stradbroke Island, which is a long way away from the boat. One of them died in the process. He drank seawater, but three of them came ashore and were looked after by the forerunners of the Connemooka people. And they were able to, two of them were able to, and one of them was Pamphlet and Finnegan. The other one, Pamphlet, Finnegan and escaped my mind, they actually helped John Oxley. The third one ran away because he was a convict. And they showed John Oxley the Brisbane River in 1843. And only a couple of years later they established a penal colony at Redcliffe. And that was later moved to Brisbane. And so that was why we had Brisbane, which was named, I think, in 1834. And at that time, a lot of people were squatting on land where they shouldn't have been, and the government couldn't keep up with it. And eventually they just had to do it. There was so much pressure to form a settlement, and so the penal colony was discontinued, and Brisbane came into being as a city. I think it was about 1826 that they had the penal colony here, and about 1834 that Brisbane was called the city. But before that, Captain Logan, who was apparently a very cruel man, surveyed this area, and he got a lieutenant Guinness to survey the bay while he did the Logan River and so on. And so this island was called Innes Island at first. And once it had been surveyed, then people could start about developing it. And they found that it was very rich agriculturally. And they, at one point, Russell Island produced more tomatoes per unit area than anywhere else in the world.
Oh, wow.
And those were sent to Sydney by boat to the markets there. But there was also quite a lot of greedy development in those islands. And famously, in Russell and the Bay, they were selling blocks that went underwater at high tide. And it became something of a scandal. And so the Surveyor General in 1878 decreed, which they could do in those days, that all surveyors from that day should leave 150 links from high tide to the property line. It was a bit too late for most of the island, but Coochie had not been developed. The reason was that it had been given to the Acclimatisation Society from about 1864, but within a couple of years, about 1867, a group of people came down here in 1864. It was a real junket. They were all councillors or whatever. It was a big party. They were on a chartered schooner, and they came to Coochie and they went down to Tipler's. And they had a swim in the lagoons, in the wetlands, and generally partied on. Then when they found that the Queensland government would give them the island, they found the rules and regulations were too much to handle, and so they gave it back. And the result was this island was not settled until 1885. And a survey was done in the year before that by a chap called George MacDonald, who was actually a Victorian. But a few months before he did the survey, he was happily working for the Victorian government when the government turned around and sacked all public servants, and he found himself out of a job. And so it was just by chance he came up to Queensland and became the chap who surveyed our island. He did most of the western half, but the eastern half was left empty. When he did the survey, he put these 150 links right around the circumference of the island. And we're the only island in Queensland that has that. And we tried to tell them when we were applying for it to be registered. They argued over some minor detail. They said, no, it's not true, but it is actually true because you're hearing it now. So we're quite unique. And it was just that chance of history that we were given to the Acclimatisation Society. And instead of rabbits, we wound up with people. Well, we keep going.
150 links, is that meters?
150 leagues. The league is 20 centimetres, and so it's about 30 metres. And just by chance, it's also a second degree of latitude, a second of latitude. So I'm guessing, thinking, a surveyor would think that way. So we have a circumference of at least a second of latitude. A minute of latitude is about 30 miles or so. Okay. We're now about in the southeast corner of the island, and as I said, you can pick up stone tools on the beach here very easily if you just walk along at low tide. This was significant to the Quandamooka people because this is where you see the sun come up. And so a lot of activities happened around here. As I said, they came here seasonally, and they hunted the dolphins and the dugong and turtles, and they harvested a bungal fern, which I'll show you in a minute, to make flour. And we found on the island 3 grindstones. And they're basically a mortar and a pestle of the sandstone. One of them was found by Dennis O'Connor, who was the brother of the first secretary of the society. He was an architect and they were building a house here and they found it. And it went into the ownership of a lady who was very interested in history, and then she donated it to the society. And it wound up on Merle Beckett's veranda, and then from there it went into a cupboard in the history room. And it was extremely heavy. We eventually voted to give it back to the Quandamooka people. And so I invited Michael Costello to come over and get it. And I got down on my knees, lifted it up like this, and handed it to him, and he said, thanks, and put it in his backpack. He was a fairly big bloke. And anyway, it went back to Stratty, and we invited ourselves over there for a presentation ceremony to give it back to them, to the aunties in Dunwich. They've got a keeping place there. But, so this was a place where they were seasonally active. And one of the things they did was build canoes and also build the containers for food and so on. And this is how they did it. This is called a scar tree, and I think it's a stringy bark. And you have to think that this is about 120 or 30 years old. And that tree was once young and good looking. And they put stone wedges in the shape of a canoe hull over a period of weeks. And eventually the skin pops off, and they soak it in water and scrub it with rocks, and it becomes a bit like a plywood sheet. But the poor old tree has been subjected to this abuse, and if you'll notice it's been hurt, you can see how it's swollen, and they often spit out a bit of their pith as they're healing. And so that's a bit of pith from the little...
Yeah.
Well, there used to be a sign here saying scar trees, but it's gone. But there are about 8 or 9 on the isle. The green plant you see here is a thistle, and it's a weed.
And why did it sit down out?
Because it's been damaged. Because it's taking away the bark. Because damage to the tree. I don't know. But
So that they can...
that one's sort of thrown in, but often it's a bigger sort of... And I mean the trees down there. They don't come coming out.
Oh, right, there it is. Yeah.
Over here is the remnant of the bungwal fern. You can see it's covered it and so on, but that fern over there, I think the Aborigines would have pulled them up, pounded the root, washed it in water, and got the flour out of it. You can also see how it's on a flatbed here, and then it goes up, and that's where 20,000 years ago the sea level was that much higher, and pushed up against the... One of the very early settlers here, the earliest settler was the permanent settlers, were Doug Norton and Eric Gordon. What happened was that a person had bought a block of land on PT and wanted to farm it, but it hadn't been successful. He sold it on to someone called Philip Gordon, who, as a fine gesture to returning service, asked Doug Norton and Eric Gordon if they'd like to be share farmers on it. Doug Norton, and when the surgeons got better, they sent him to Salt and was in the battle for Moffat Farm. And he was very brave. He took on a machine gun post and managed to get there. By the time he got there, he followed down the tunnels that they had, or the trenches that they had, and discovered another, what would you call it, another post, and went back and reported it. So it was something he didn't have to do. He could have just gone back to his own thing. But on the way back, he was blown up by a shell. And he was lying in a pile of bodies and mud and stuff. And just by sheer good luck, a lull in the fighting, the stretcher bearer saw his hand move, and they dragged him out, and on the field they put a metal plate in his head. And it put him in a perennial bad mood. As well as that, he was covered in shrapnel. But he recovered and he got the military medal for it. And Rosemary O'Pala met him when she was a young nurse. And in her memoirs, she talked about him not being very voluble, not very talkative. But the only person he seemed to talk to was his bleary-eyed old dog. But his wife Mary was from the farming family of Colburn Avenue. And she, as a young thing, used to help bring cattle over from their property, let them graze on the beaches. And Doug fell in love with her. And they got married, and she was the only woman on the island for about a dozen years. And they're a pioneering family. But the other pioneering family is Bruce Phillips. And we've written up a lot about Doug Lawson. And Bruce used to have a tin shed here. And he was a retired jeweller or something like that. And some people say magistrate, I suppose he can be both. And he was a bit of a tyrant. He never let his wife go to the hospital. But he was kind-hearted to people who were everybody else. Yeah. And we thought of doing something about that with the family, you know, so there's not all the streets up here are named after their kids. Shirley and James. Carefree was the name of their boat. We had a gentleman's lord up here. And so we got in touch with the families and invited them over, only to discover they all hated each other. Because he had adopted some Billy, but he was such an authoritarian that I think Billy was about 35 and Bruce still held his passport in the Commonwealth Bank. But the island this part of the island was actually developed under Bill Phillips' name, and the first jetty was built here, and anybody who bought a block of land had to donate £10 to build the jetty, and so it became known as the £10 jetty. But soon after that, the island went over to Redland Council. It was Shire Council then, and things started to happen. And so a proper jetty was built, piston came, a water came, and things really started to happen. And soon after that, many gardens were built, and kiosks were built, and this kiosk is built mini gardens about 75. Things were looking good. But then the inevitable happened, and the people who had a mini garden, they had a restaurant called the Belgian, and a very long jetty going out to Doug Lawson's facility. And it was said that often fall into the ferry waiting for them with Dick Whitehall, and he was usually drunk as well, on the tiller. He was a friend of the guy who built our house, Valentine Admiralty. And Admiralty had in the dining room a round table with the map of the world inlaid in it, and Dick Whitehall and he would argue politics over the table. And the house came to be known as the Kremlin for that.
And David, talking about street names, do you know anything about what we've got the Maria Morana, about all the M street names? Is there any reason or we've got all those names starting there? Yeah, but that's always fascinated me.
Usually they're Aboriginal land.
Out of a cock pot.
I've remembered the name of the surveyor. It was George MacDonald. Our population in the census 5 years ago was 850, with a median age of 67. And I suspect that median will go down because we've had so many new people in the past couple of years who are younger than that. But I haven't got any particular reason for stopping here, except to point out the cypress, how it grows like a jungle. And in the 1890s, it was people brought bullocks over and cut these cypress, and they floated up to Brisbane to make the wharves in Brisbane. And it has a lot of resin in its wood, and that resists the marine teredo worm. And so we really helped build the wharves in Brisbane here.
Oh, that's fascinating. And they would have been obviously much bigger back in those days.
Oh yes, there were a lot of big cypress on the island, but the island was virtually logged flat. In fact, one of the developers tried to repeat that idea. He said, if we knock down every tree on the island, everyone will have a water view.
Oh my God.
And they would have been right. Yes. On the beach here,
I know, right, can't
where
help
the rocks
myself.
are, you can pick up Aboriginal tools. You should put them back, but you'll find the way you can tell them is that, to just start again, there were 3 Aboriginal clans who claimed ownership of the island. The Goanpils and the Noonuckles were one language group, and the Noogies were the 3rd one, so they were in a slightly different language group. And they came here seasonally, but they traded with tribes in the Lochy Valley and so on for rocks to use to make stone tools, because there weren't any rocks on the island. The only rocks you'll find are the purpley ones up in the northeast, which I think are sandstone, about 20,000 years old, when the water level was higher and the sand was pushed onto the island and then compacted, because that's quite soft rock. But any rock that looks like chalcedony or quartz or whatever is likely to be an Aboriginal tool that they just used until they got blunt and then they threw them aside. But they're quite common all here. I thought of putting one in my pocket and then showing it to you, but I shouldn't have it anyway. Not cypress pine, I think they're just... But the reason for stopping here is that you might have noticed that we're on a road. This is a sort of unofficial road. It was made by the Bucks. Anyway, she drove very fast. But they made their own road here, just to save time, and it became a road. But in ex-tropical cyclone 2013, the cyclone crossed the coast and became a rain depression and continued on down the coast, but inland, which is very unusual. So the winds were in an unusual position and they cut away all of this beach. It happened to coincide with when coast care was formed on the island, and the road was cut. And the islanders demanded that the road be replaced. But the council found it hadn't been there anyway. They couldn't replace something that wasn't there. And if it had been there, they couldn't do it because regulations said that you have to be back a certain distance from high tide. And they couldn't do that without cutting into the... But that was not the way the islanders heard it. The islanders heard it that there was a conspiracy on the island, that the greenies didn't want dust and so on, and they didn't want the road to be here. So petitions were written and so on. And in the process, you know how the island gets very angry very quickly and very divided, and camps form. In the process, someone told me that 2 young women, 2 young Aboriginal women, had been murdered on the island and buried here somewhere. And the reason they knew that was the guy who told me was sitting on his veranda and he saw a big black Mercedes drive up. Now, I'll mention the black Mercedes because I'm going to talk about another car in a minute. And out of it got a gigantic Chinese lady and a very little Aboriginal one. And they were hunting around. And he said, what are you looking for? And they said, we're looking for a grave that was here for 2 girls. And he suggested they go and see Denise Foley because it gets some background. During the war, number 42 and 43 landing companies were based here, landing craft companies. And their training was to bring barges onto the land and let troops off. And we've got a lot of photographs of that. And so it wasn't the landing craft companies who did it, but the troops that they were carrying were training too. Over on Victoria Point, where the VMR is, now called Marine Rescue, was a brothel called the Wishing, which has gone through many iterations and is now up for lease. These two girls may have come from there, but something went wrong and they were murdered by the infantry near where the kiosk is and buried in William Street. But word got out and Tokyo Rose in Japan used it as a leverage to see how rotten the Australian troops really are, whereas the noble Japanese troops didn't do that sort of thing. And particularly the Aborigines. The general in charge came here to tell people to shush it all up. I've forgotten his name. Laney came up here in his Rolls Royce, which was then brought over on a barge, and said it was all untrue and so on. And the only reason we ever heard about it by previous iterations was that Blamey's driver became the speedway in Brisbane, and he told somebody whose grandfather told him. So, okay, so the equation closed. and I was president of the Historical Society then, and I felt honour bound to tell people. And then I was held down. And the Aborigines in Dunwich wrote a letter saying it's not true, and so on. But soon after that, the council was looking to improve the turning area for the garbage trucks, because there's no, the road just ends and they have to turn. And before they built a road, they had to check what was under it. So they got the chap from Coffs Harbour up, Gaff, to bring ground sensing radar to look under the open area where we were just looking at the scar trees to find out if there was any Aboriginal remains under it. And they found that there'd been an old road, but while they were here, I said to them, can you come and have a look at this grave idea? Because when I got into so much trouble over it, I was active in Coast Care at the time. We had a meeting, and magically, on a post, was a fragment of gravestone. And then we had another meeting. Vivian Roberts-Thompson took them, but then they started giving her the heebie-jeebies. And I think she handed them over to Ray Weir, but she didn't feel comfortable with them, so I took them up to the history room. And with the below ground sonar radar sensing thing, there was an archaeologist came as well, and she'd just been working on the Brisbane cemetery, and so she looked at these gravestones and said, no, it couldn't have been war. These were 1935 or so. They could tell by the engraving, the way the engraving was filled with lead. And so the plot thickened. And so they brought the radar up, and I knew where the grave was because we'd marked it by a tree. And they found that there actually was disturbance there. So there is a grave there, but they couldn't tell whether their bodies in it or anything. They could just tell that the ground had been disturbed. Since then, the tree has fallen over, and I've lost it all again. So it just makes a good story.
The next guy comes along.
What's your folklore? Yes, exactly. And here's the thing you're doing.
I keep forgetting to finish stories, but I said that a big black Mercedes pulled up, which made me think of the Rolls Royce with General Blamey in it. And the big Chinese lady was one of the big Aboriginal families on the island, on the bay, but a branch of them went to the Philippines and invested in ferries there and became very wealthy. And this lady had retired to Hong Kong and then decided to come and see one of her relations' grave in Australia. And the Coolwells are important here too because the bay was very rich in oysters, and one of the Coolwells was called Oyster Bob Cool, and he'd go round the bay in a barge and buy oysters from people and sell them up in Brisbane. But the reason we stopped here is this rock. It was laid in 1997 because Ted Jones, who lived in Cooper Street, an ex-navigator in bombers, Mitchell bombers, in Borneo, he looked into Flinders explorations in the bay. There was a very well-known amateur historian called Thomas Welsby, after which that street is named, and he had said that Flinders landed on Pat Point in McLean. But Ted reworked the figures and decided that Flinders actually landed here. And it caused ructions on the island because everybody said, no, Thomas Welby says it's over on Pat Point, not McLean. But Ted persisted, and eventually he was successful. Isabel Callahan was one of his supporters. She's Olive Walker's mother. And they prevailed. And we really owe it to Ted that we were put on the charts by Matthew Flinders. Flinders took a sextant reading. It was 27 degrees, 34 minutes, 59 seconds south, which puts it closer to here than at the point. But also Ted actually mapped the way he'd sail the boat. And he thought, Flinders thought, that this was a river. And that was his job, to follow that river. But he got to a start here and he kept hitting on sandbanks and he just got sick of it and called it off. But he came ashore to take a sextant reading because it would be more accurate on the land than at sea, and to put it on the charts. And because Ted had prevailed, Redland City Council took up, I think it's E.G. Wood, the councillor who was very active on Coochie, and they had a ceremony here and laid this stone. The stone used to be over there, but the beach had been eroded, and so a few years ago the stone was brought here. And there was a ceremony, and Ted had it set up so that there was a curtain over the stone, and the curtain was on a piece of string with a weight on it. And Ted had it set up so the magnifying glass, when the sun reached its zenith, would burn through the skin, the string, and the stone would pull the curtain apart. And lo and behold, it worked. It just went according to plan. But then they discovered they didn't have the right to name the beach. There's a body called Place Names Committee. It's one of those things you inherit, one father to son and so on, who decides what place names will be. And they said you cannot name the beach. So 5 years passed and they relented. And in 1981 it became officially Norfolk Beach. And from then on Ted used to start to do the reenactments, which have continued unbroken till today, this year.
July 19th.